was because the altar of God lay in ruins. The reason the children of Israel were worshiping the false god of Baal rather than the one true God is because the altar of God lay in ruins. The reason why the land was incredibly evil was because the altar of God lay in ruins. The reason the spiritual atmosphere and the spiritual climate was nil was because the altar of God lay in ruins. And so Elijah, the man of God, who might just be visiting with us today, come on out, Elijah. Don't strain yourself lifting those heavy stones. Now, go ahead and take a look at Elijah, and then let him just become kind of the backdrop for what I'm saying, okay? And so Elijah, the man of God, decided to pick up the ruins of the altar and reconstruct the altar of God. Elijah, the man of God, took it upon himself to rebuild the altar of God. Elijah stood alone, but that was okay because God was on his side and he understood the importance of the altar. And so he began to take what lay in ruins and he began to restore the altar of God. And he did this so that Israel could be positioned for a new work of God. So that Israel could receive a new blessing from God. So that Israel could provoke a miracle from God. So that a new spiritual line could be drawn in the lives of the people. And so Elijah began picking up the pieces of the broken altar of God. And as each piece was restored to the altar, Elijah began to remind the Israelites of what God had done for them. Because they had forgotten that God had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. They had forgotten that God had led them through the Red Sea. They had forgotten that God had provided water out of a rock, not once, but twice. And as Elijah picked up the stones of this ruined altar, and he began to place the stones one on top of the other, the Israelites began to remember what they had forgotten. God had provided manna in the wilderness and quail in the desert. God had brought them to a land that was flowing with milk and honey and all the good things they could eat. God had helped them fight giants and win. God had restored to them everything that they had lost. And they had forgotten all the great things that God had done for them. And the altar of God lay in ruins. But as Elijah reconstructed the altar, the Israelites were reminded again and again. As each stone was put in its proper place, they were reminded of God's faithfulness, God's provision, God's mercy, God's grace, God's hand, God's forgiveness, God's protection, and God's healing. And as Elijah, piece by piece, stone by stone, rebuilt the altar of God, the Israelites' past memories of God once again became present reality. And as Elijah continued to reconstruct the altar, with each stone, the Israelites were reminded of their spiritual journey with God. As Elijah continued to rebuild and restore the altar, the distant memories and miracles of God that were just a past reality suddenly became a present reality. And they began to think back and remember all the times and the places and the dates and the occasions, all those encounters that they had had with God, but over the years they had forgotten. You see, our tendency is over time to allow our spiritual experience to grow cold. Because, hey, life just happens. And we forget about the awesome things that God has done for us. And when we forget about these experiences, what happens is over time, the altars in our life begin to get weeds around them, and they slowly become overgrown with vines and thickets and foliage. And over time, what once had stood as a shining testimony to an awesome experience with God now kind of just lies in ruins. And our spiritual experience has grown cold. And that's why we need to reconstruct the altars in our life. That's why we need to do exactly what Elijah did. We need to reconstruct the altars in our lives. As believers, we have these incredible experiences and moments with God, and He helps us. He encourages us. He strengthens us. He works in our life in a supernatural way. And we have these moments, and during these moments we say, I'll never be the same. I'm going to stay changed forever. But the truth of the matter is, even though God works in our lives in incredible and personal ways, and God meets with us, and we're overwhelmed by His goodness and grace, and it might even be right here in this church, or it might be driving to work, or it might be on your back porch, or out in the middle of the lake, or it might be right here at this altar. But if you're a believer, my friend, all of us have had altars. All of us have altars that we can point back to. All of us have had spiritual lines drawn in our life. But our tendency over time is to let that spiritual experience to just kind of die out. Now hear me. What's so powerful to me about this story is that it reminds us that we need to reconstruct the altars in our life. And the way that we do that is just like Elijah did it here, stone by stone. We need to look at our lives and remind ourselves of all the ways that God has worked in our lives. And if in our minds, as we evaluate the spiritual lines that have been drawn in our life, as we stop and think about the altars in our life, if they are in disrepair, if they are in ruins, if they need to be reconstructed, then we need to go back in our minds, maybe even to a physical place in our life, if that's possible, but we need to go back to that time and that place and that occasion where God helped us, and we need to say, okay, God, I've allowed my spiritual experiences to grow cold, and I'm asking you to help me reconstruct and rebuild and restore this altar in my life. God, I made you a promise, and I didn't keep it. And I'm sorry. I told you I was going to change, and I changed for a while, but now I'm kind of back to my own self. God, I made you a vow to be a better dad, a better husband, a better wife, a daughter, a son. And for a while, wow, God, I could really sense you were helping me and working in my life. I sensed your presence so real. But now I've kind of blown that experience that I had with you. I've kind of let other things take the place of you. And God, I want that experience again. And so God, with your help, I'm going to rebuild this altar. And I'm asking you to restore my spiritual life, restore my spiritual zeal, the spiritual atmosphere and the spiritual excitement that I once had. Because God, I realize today that the altars in my life are a symbolic reminder of those times I've had with you. They're kind of a spiritual map of my life. And right now, God, if I were honest, I would say I'm kind of zigzagging all over the place in my spiritual life. And I don't want to do that anymore. I want to get back on track. And I want to stay on track in my spiritual journey. And I want to stay on top of things in my relationship with you. So God, please help me to reconstruct the altars in my life. The altar is a place, a time, or occasion where a spiritual line is drawn in our life. And the reason we need to be aware of the altars in our life is because our tendency over time is to allow our spiritual experiences to grow cold. Think about Elijah here. Think about the coldness in the nation of Israel at that time. Elijah understood that. That's why he reconstructed the altar of God. Listen to what happens next. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Jacob. Remember, Jacob's one of those guys I talked about earlier who was always building altars to God. The same Jacob to whom God had said, from now on your name is Israel. That name